All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling an absolutely massive story. We're talking about the thrilling, chaotic progression of human history, literally tracking it all the way from floating atoms 3 billion years ago right up to the dawn of the modern world. We're going to piece together exactly how we went from microscopic specks to these dominant, incredibly complex societies. To make sense of thousands of years of history, we're breaking this macro story down into 5 distinct leaps of scale: the dawn of agriculture, rise of the empires, philosophers, prophets, and faith, the global collision, and finally, the birth of the modern era. So let's jump right into part 1, the dawn of agriculture, settling down. We start off jumping incredibly fast from the microscopic origins of life all the way to 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia. Right here, in the ancient city of Uruk, human ingenuity sparked a total revolution. You see, instead of constantly chasing our food around as nomads, we actually learned to crush cereal grains with hand mills. We figured out how to grow it ourselves.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the physical cost of all that progress. Inventing agriculture meant cities like Uruk could absolutely boom. We're talking up to a staggering 50,000 people. But the grueling physical labor of farming actually caused human bodies to drastically shrink in size. We went from these agile 5'9" nomads down to landlocked 5'3" farmers. So hey, apparently the original paleo diet really was the real deal.
Moving right along to part 2, rise of the empires, systems of control. As these local settlements completely ballooned in massive regional populations, early leaders had to figure out a brand new problem. How do you organize thousands of people? As we build on this timeline, you can see how from the Indus Valley to ancient Egypt and Babylon, empires existing at roughly the exact same time prioritized vastly different mechanisms for maintaining civilization.
This brilliantly illustrates just how diverse human priorities were back then. On one hand, you have the Indus Valley civilization absolutely obsessing over cutting-edge public hygiene. They were building advanced underground plumbing and literal flush toilets to prevent disease. But then, on the other hand, the Egyptians were dedicating grueling decades of labor to the heavens, building these massive pyramids just to ensure their pharaohs ruled eternally in the afterlife. It's 2 massive empires with 2 completely opposite definitions of what a civilization should prioritize.
Over in China, though, the Zhou dynasty organized their empire through this fascinating psychological system called the Mandate from Heaven. Basically, it set up a cyclical rhythm of rising and falling dynasties. It was a 4-step system where power followed merit. If an emperor was virtuous, he got to rule. But if the heavens sent disasters, droughts, floods, earthquakes, it meant the leader had lost divine approval. And that gave the people the ultimate justification for a brand new dynasty to step in and take over.
Meanwhile, the Greek city-states offer us this super stark contrast in how to govern. Sparta, they built a rigid, merciless military machine where society was just built for war, brutally conditioning boys from a really young age. But Athens experimented with a complex, kind of chaotic democracy. They literally used a random lottery machine called a claritarian to pick their leaders. It was basically an ancient bingo cage for politicians. But chaotic as it was, it laid the groundwork for modern political thought.
That brings us to part 3, philosophers, prophets, and faith shaping the mind. Now we're tracking the emergence of major spiritual movements all across the globe. And we're seeing a massive, fundamental shift in human organization here. We start moving away from purely political empires held together by strict laws or sheer military force, and we shift toward these massive, belief-based communities. Suddenly, people are bound together by shared theology.
The Greek philosopher Plato famously desperately wanted a wise philosopher king to rule rather than a chaotic democracy. He really believed that only someone who dedicated their life to logic could properly navigate society's troubles. But look at the historical pattern emerging. Every leader was starting to realize something crucial. To truly rule a population, you had to capture their minds. You had to claim absolute truth.
So the crucial point here is that these 3 wildly distinct figures profoundly transformed humanity, shifting the whole macro story away from regional warlords and straight into the era of global faiths. You have Siddhartha Gautama finding inner peace and enlightenment as the Buddha. You have Jesus Christ spreading a faith that eventually overtook the entire Roman Empire, and Muhammad uniting the Arabian Peninsula under one God. Together, they created ideological empires that outlasted literally any physical kingdom.
But, of course, then we get the inevitable friction when these massive, deeply devout empires intersect.
Think about it. Once you have sprawling civilizations unified by absolute, exclusive beliefs, massive clashes are pretty much guaranteed. And that led directly to centuries of brutal, deeply complex conflicts, like the Crusades. Powerful empires repeatedly fought over Holy Land and sacred cities, like Jerusalem. It really showcases the terrifying power of faith when it's weaponized by military empires.
All right, moving to part 4, the global collision, conquest and connection.
Our historical timeline compresses a lot here. We're looking at a few devastating but deeply interconnected centuries that just forcibly shrank the globe. From the sudden, explosive rise of the Mongol Empire to a sweeping global pandemic, and eventually European ships crossing the Atlantic, human isolation was coming to a very abrupt end.
To really grasp the terrifying vastness of Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, you have to consider this staggering number: 8%. Today, roughly 8% of men in South Asia are directly descended from him. That is mind-blowing. His cavalry-driven war machine united and forcibly mixed populations on an unprecedented scale.
But here's the thing. It wasn't just armies crossing borders anymore. Microscopic forces were traveling too. The bubonic plague hitched a ride along merchant ships in the Silk Road, and it wiped out enormous swaths of the global population. We're talking up to 200 million dead. It was a horrific biological collision, caused directly by our brand-new interconnected trade routes, and it totally reshaped global economics. Now, history is full of strange cause and effect moments. Get this. The devastating tragedy of the Black Death accidentally planted the early seeds for modern workers' rights. Since there was this massive population loss, the surviving peasant farmers suddenly realized they had unprecedented leverage. They could actually demand better conditions and keep more of their crops. For the first time, the iron grip of that classic feudal pyramid really started to crack.
The final truly brutal collision of this era happened over in the Americas. You had incredibly advanced indigenous civilizations like the Aztecs and Incas with their immense wealth, complex canals, and floating chinapas. But they were abruptly decimated. European conquistadors arrived with a devastating combination: superior military technology like guns and cannons, and most destructively, accidental biological warfare. They brought diseases like smallpox, which their bodies already had immunity to, completely wiping out the local populations.
And that brings us to our final leap of scale. Part 5, Birth of the Modern Era, the Shift in Power. This final timeline tracks an agonizingly slow shift. We're talking about power finally moving away from absolute monarchs and untouchable popes and shifting toward the individual. It kicks off with the Magna Carta in 1215, giving barons basic legal protections. Then Martin Luther throws down his 95 Theses in 1517, challenging the unquestioned authority of the church. And eventually, all this momentum spills right across the Atlantic.
Listen to this famous 1776 quote: "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." That right there represents the ultimate culmination of our 3-billion-year journey. It completely flips the ancient script. We went from peasants existing solely to serve divine pharaohs or philosopher kings to a nation being built on the explicit written premise that power belongs to the people.
So, looking back at millennia of empires rising, falling, and colliding, we see how humanity just constantly reinvents its systems of survival and control. From harvesting wheat by hand, to building massive pyramids, to establishing global faiths, and finally demanding individual rights, the scale of our civilization literally never stops shifting. Which leaves us with one incredibly fascinating question. Given all these massive leaps we've made so far, what new leaps of scale will define the next chapter of human civilization?